colonization of New Zealand, the Holocaust, the invasion of Iraq, these events might seem completely disconnected, sorted by their own struggles, their own politics, their own eras. However, among them, they share one single commonality. A quote by George Orwell in the novel from 1984 expresses this similarity in its most basic complexity. Who controls the past, controls the future. And in this document, it really connects to these events, each individually, showing how they each involve the involvement of a minority being subjugated by a leading authority, controlling the present and moving that on to the future. I'm Alberto Rico Zambrana, and this is the harm of historic governmental intervention. So the research question I chose when I was looking into this topic was, how has authority intervention during national events involving minorities caused subsequent hardship for those minorities involved? And in order to answer this question, I used some specific events which, as featured on the first slides, I believe best reflected the situation. So first is an event of deception with the colonization of New Zealand and the Maori. The next is an example of blame with the Holocaust and the impact of the Nazi party on the Jewish minority, along with other minorities, of course. And finally was the impact of fear with US action and how that action following September 11th attacks drove it into war and security enhancements, drastically impacting Muslim life. So first of all, the Treaty of Waitangi was a very controversial part of New Zealand history, with its implications trying to allow for a partnership between the Maori and New Zealand colonists. However, it was a lot of translation that was involved in making the two versions of the document almost completely different, with one example being how in the Maori version it states for protection and exercise of chieftainship, whereas in the English version it only explains for undisturbed possession by the Maori, which doesn't really promise any of the exact promises of the Maori version of the signed document, as pointed out by Janine Hayward. Next up is the impact on Maori individuals of the, more looking into the present. And looking into the present, there's an example of a young girl who didn't know much about her great-grandfather, Takuti insurgency leader, who, according to Judith Binney of the College Board Provided Stimulus Maori Oral Narratives, Written Text, this was a result of suppression due to shame and how her great-grandfather was viewed as an arch rebel in the eyes of New Zealand society. Next up is the impact of the Holocaust, and starting before the Holocaust was World War I, which led to a variety, after Germany's loss, a variety of terrible conditions for Germany, which the National Socialist Party of Germany curved towards minorities such as Jews, establishing the Nuremberg laws, including the right citizenship law and the law of German blood, both of which establishing terrible terms for minorities. With the right citizenship law establishing that anybody of non-pure German origin was considered not to be a citizen, and the next of the two establishing that no marriage could happen between Jews and Germans. Along with this is a graph showcasing these laws. It's spread around by German government. Here's an enhanced version of the graph showing how the translating version shows the separation of Germans into 5 different categories: pure German, 2 of crossbreed, and 2 of Jewish, with anybody with more than 3 Jewish grandparents being considered a full Jew in the eyes of German society, ineligible for marriage with Germans or citizenship at all. Next up is the Holocaust and the suffering it caused for, in concentration camps, Jews, and one example being the example of the Musulmane, who were those who had completely given up on life due to the hopeless conditions of concentration, with the next example referring to basically a memorial for the horrible events that occurred as a result of this suppression. Next up is the effect of the September 11th attacks and the fear it drove Americans into, with these leading to broad security enhancements for the United States nation. Although it's arguable that these enhancements were successful, according to the bottom survey, which showed that only 18.1% disagreed that this was not an effective means of counterterrorism, meaning it was generally supported even by Muslims. The 226 Muslim Americans surveyed also supported that this was basically a means of discrimination still, due to 63.7% of individuals reporting being selectively screened at the airports as a result. Finally, going into one of the last topics is an example of US invasion. Following the September 11th attacks, this led to invasion of Iraq due to the US fear that such an attack could happen in the future. And in Iraq, the army was disbanded, leading to a variety of protests, as can be seen in this image with the protester protesting for his removal from the Iraqi military, with these events causing drastic hardships for Muslims in the Middle East, even if it wasn't directly intended, with the formation of ISIS being a result later on, as a result of an insurgency recruiting these uninspired, these really holding hatred for Western society. And this led them to creating this ISIS group. Now, before coming to a conclusion, there were a bunch of constraining factors that I did have to consider, which were, there wasn't a lot of research directly explaining the correlation between this past and present relationship that I was talking about. And I had to basically piece that stuff together on my own, which was interesting, but I think it still came to a proper conclusion. Along with there was limitations on historical information. For example, I couldn't quite get my proper hand on Maori history or Muslim history regarding the impacts of security changes, which I had to find on my own in my meantime. And finally, there was the impact on, probably the most important thing is that there's only 3 historical examples being considered in this overall presentation, and there are so many. For example, following the attacks on Pearl Harbor, the United States enforced specific control, putting Japanese immigrants into basically camps as a result due to fear that such a thing could happen again. Now, coming to a final conclusion, I believe that there were some things held by some events as listed here, but the main point I'm trying to make is that this correlation between the past and the future is what drove authorities to intervene as a result of minority events and cause hardship for such minorities in the future. Thank you for your attention.
All right, 2 questions for you. First up, what information did you need but you weren't able to find, and then how'd you deal with that?
So some information I needed, as I think I mentioned earlier, was there was no real good information on Maori history following New Zealand colonization. I believe that it was likely a result of suppression and how some of that stuff was silenced. But the main thing I'm trying to say is that I had to find a way to work around that, relying on more historically known events in order to draw a conclusion from that event.
All right, and if you, what advice would you have for other people that are thinking about this as a topic in the future?
I'd say it's really important to consider the implications of these events and how this past-present relationship was really, it could happen again in the future potentially, and this history repeats itself scenario is important to look into if you want to study this topic in the future. Thank you.